Thanks again for being with us, and we're going to continue on. We've been trekking through the Gospel of Matthew for quite some time now. Took a little break over the Christmas season, but we're working toward the last stages of Jesus' life and death, the last week of his life and the things that we're going through. So we're going to step into that. But last week, we took a look at some different images. And the one we took a look at last week was the Passover. The Passover was a Jewish holiday, started back in the time of Moses, and it remembered a time when, for a few hundred years, Israel was enslaved in the nation of Egypt. And then there finally came a point where God used a man named Moses to bring those people out of that slavery, and some kind of miraculous events as well to convince the Pharaoh at that time to release all these slaves that the nation of Israel had become at that time. And so we talked about how there's different images that kind of collide when we think about the death of Jesus or we think about the cross. And that's the next image that I have on the slide here for you. All these images come together because, again, as we said last week, a picture is worth what? 1,000 words, right? And so God paints pictures for us because he can convey so many things on so many levels, and not even use very many words to do it. And so he gives us a picture to really investigate and jump into. And this morning we're going to finish talking about more of the Passover and some of that imagery and how it relates to Jesus' death specifically. But also we're going to check into a second image today, and that's an image called a covenant. And we'll get into that in a little while, in the second half of what we're going to do this morning. And I want to start off we're going to step into a Passover meal. And I don't know how many, is anybody here Jewish by ethnicity or tradition? No one here today. And so chances are we're not going to be super familiar with the traditional Passover meal and how this went along. And so I want to read just some information from a man named D.T. Lancaster. He's a pastor and elder at a Messianic synagogue. So it's a Jewish synagogue, but they believe Jesus is their Messiah. And so he gives us a really helpful summary of what this Passover meal looked like back at the time of Jesus. We had some Jewish writings that came along. About 150 years after Jesus' time, they were solidified in writing, but they described the traditions that were in place when Jesus was here as well. And so it's going to help us step into the world and understand what's happening, because we just get this short little paragraph, of Jesus having a Passover with his followers, and we're like, that's great. But when we see what the order was and why it was the way it was, it helps everything make so much more sense. So I want to read what he has, how he summarizes that. He said, the Passover meal, it began after dark, because Jewish days, they didn't start in the morning with the sunrise, they started at sunset. They went from sunset till sunset the next day. So it started after dark. They didn't eat anything from the middle of the day until they had all settled in around the table that night, he says. Over the course of the evening, each person drank 4 different ceremonial cups of wine. It's small cups about this size. And as a part of the ceremony, they had a cup. And think of it this way. It's like a cup for each course. You use a cup of wine to start the next course, because each course is separate and each of it has meaning, looking back to those times when Israel was freed from slavery in Egypt. So there's some kind of meaning attached to it. And Jesus is going to latch on to that and not only apply it to the past, but apply it to what he's about to go through over the next 24 hours himself. So we're going to learn a new meaning to some of those courses as well. And it says, after the first cup, the ceremony started with bitter herbs and vegetables dipped into a vinegar sop. So you had a bowl of vinegar at the table, and maybe more than one, and people would start off after that first cup of wine by taking these vegetables and bitter herbs and dipping them into like red wine vinegar. And that's how they would start the course. And the meaning of that is kind of obscure. There isn't a lot of record, but the opinion seems to be that it was somehow representative of what started this exodus into Egypt, or this entrance into Egypt, or descent down into Egypt and slavery in the first place. And that was when a guy named Joseph was betrayed by his other brothers. And they took his coat that his father gave him, his special favorite son coat. They took it off of him, they threw him in a pit, and then they sold him to a caravan of slave traders and took him down to Egypt. And that's what ended up bringing all of Israel's family down into Egypt in the first place. But they took his coat off, and to convince his father that he was dead, they dipped it in the blood of a goat. And so maybe this dipping is synonymous of that bitter experience that sent Israel down into Egypt in the first place, that betrayal, you might even say. So perhaps. Then after that, the servers would put out the unleavened bread that we talked about last week, the matzah. And then they had also like a fruit compote, like a mixture of fruits. And then the Passover lamb would be set out at the table as well. And they had a child, typically at these Passover dinners, ask a few specific questions. They knew what questions to ask, the same questions every year. And then the father, whoever was hosting the Passover feast, in this case it's Jesus, he's kind of the, narrating everything and emceeing the whole event. They would take some verses in Deuteronomy 25 that just gave a short summary of what Israel experienced, how they were sent down to Egypt, how they were enslaved, how God rescued them and brought them into a new promised fruitful land that they called Israel, the land of Canaan. And so the host would give a few remarks about that story, just an overview. And then following that, would talk about the different foods. Here's the significance of the Passover lamb. Here's the significance of the unleavened bread. And we talked about that some last week. If you weren't here last week, you can watch online and just get a recap of some of that. And after that, they would start to recite some psalms. Last week, we talked about some psalms that were recited in the temple courts when the Passover lambs were killed before the meal, the preparation for the meal that night. Anybody have a good memory and remember what those psalms were? Of course not. That's kind of a secret question. Psalms 113 to 118. And so in the Passover meal, they'd bring those same psalms into the picture. And they would recite Psalm 113 and 114 at this point in time in the meal. And then that was before the second cup or the second course. And during the second course, after they'd drank the second cup of wine, the person who was kind of facilitating the whole event would take up the unleavened bread and they would break it, which we're familiar with that kind of imagery, right? From what Jesus did with the bread in a little while here. So the host would break the bread and then they would say, this is the bread of affliction, because the bread symbolized their slavery, how they were afflicted. It was unleavened bread. It didn't have time to rise. It was poor person's bread or slave bread in Egypt. And then it also became, as we learned last week, a symbol of the freedom. It was freedom bread as well. But it reminded the Jewish people of the affliction that they suffered. And when you think about the word affliction, and you think about what Jesus was going to compare the bread to, and we'll talk about that in a few moments this morning, you can see why that might be relevant. And so the bread was distributed around the table. And after that, they would eat the meal. They would have the compote and the unleavened bread and the Passover lamb, and they would partake of the meal. And then as soon as they were done, they did what we sometimes do first before a meal. If you've been raised in a religious setting, what's common to do before you start eating a meal? Praying, or some people say saying what? Grace, or offering a blessing or thanksgiving or something like that, right? Well, in Jewish culture, they didn't do it at the beginning of the meal. They did it afterwards. Because we're like, we thank God for what we haven't experienced yet. But a Jewish person at this time would have thought that was kind of strange. I mean, why thank God for what you haven't experienced? Eat the meal, for crying out loud, and then thank God for how great it was. And so they would thank God afterwards and bless him for the grace and the gift of that. And it was really called thanksgiving. They would give thanks for the meal that they had received at that point in time. And that was accompanied by the third cup of wine. And then to end the whole thing, they would take the fourth and final cup, and then here it says they would sing a hymn. That's what our English translations oftentimes say. But what they were doing is they were reciting the rest of Psalm 113 to 118. So Psalm 115, 116, 117, and 118. And that's how they concluded the Passover meal, by reciting those psalms, which again, English translations call hymns sometimes. And that helps us understand the context of what's happening when we read about these events in the following few verses. And so we want to look at this Passover meal, first of all, in terms of courses, and then we want to focus in on that term covenant that creeps up, because we don't use that term in our culture very often, but it has some really big significance when we look at what Jesus is doing for us through his death on the cross as well. And so again, just a little review. The courses are divided by 4 cups of wine. That's how things switch. And verse 20, it says, when evening came, Jesus was reclining at the table with the 12, so his 12 disciples or students. While they were eating the Passover, he said, truly I tell you, one of you will betray me. And so they're deeply distressed, it says, and they're looking at each other going, surely it's not me, is it? I'm not the one who's going to betray Jesus, am I? And then he says, the one who dipped his hand with me in the bowl, he will betray me. And this might be another, I guess, good reason to support the opinion that dipping the herbs and the vegetables, the bitter vegetables, into the sour vinegar, the red wine vinegar, might be some type of reflection on Joseph and his betrayal by his brothers. Wouldn't that be interesting if that was significant in that way for Jesus to say the one who dipped the herb, symbolizing the betrayal, into this bowl with me, and he's saying like at the same time, like when you're eating a meal, sometimes when you share bowls and dishes, you'll both reach for the same thing at the same time, right? That happens. And so this person would have been seated close to Jesus and would have been somebody who, they know, oh, there was that moment we both reached for the bowl at the same time. Other people around the table probably aren't aware of that, but that would be a marker for that person who was seated close to Jesus who went for the dish at the same time to realize, oh, Jesus is aware of this. That's the one who's going to betray me, Jesus said. So this happens during that course when they're dipping the vegetables into the wine vinegar. The Son of Man will go, Jesus says, just as it's written about him, but woe to, which really means like grief over, the person by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for him if he had not been born, which is a pretty strong statement. And then Judas, his betrayer, because Matthew's writing after the fact, and he knows how this all goes down, replied, surely it's not I, Rabbi, is it? And Jesus gave sort of this vague answer. He literally said, you said. What's that mean? Does it mean you said or you spoke or you talked? Does it mean you said it? You're the one who said it. Does it mean you're the one who talked to the high priests and already arranged this? I don't know. But again, he's speaking to Judas, who probably most likely is seated right next to him on his left at the table. So during the first course, the dipping of vegetables in vinegar, Jesus announces that one of his brothers will betray him, just like one of Joseph's brothers betrayed him. And interestingly enough, Joseph was sold for 20 pieces of silver. And Jesus is also betrayed, not for 20, but 30 pieces of silver. So again, these images, there's just so many angles and so many connections that cross at this intersection in these conversations. The next verse says, as they were eating, Jesus took bread, and he blessed, and he broke it. He gave it to the disciples, and he said, take and eat it. This is my body. And that's an interesting twist. So during the second course, when they would take the bread and they would break it, and they would say, this is the bread of affliction, and pass it around the table, Jesus does it. He breaks the bread of affliction, but he relates it not to the affliction in Egypt, the slavery that happened maybe, 12 to 1400 years previously. He says, no, this bread of affliction, it's somehow related to my body now. And again, if you know how the story turns out, you know how the body of Jesus would be afflicted and it would be broken. And that even has some significance when it comes to the covenant that we'll talk about in a few moments this morning as well. There's another aspect of Jesus' body being broken. Now we're going to talk about the third course. Then he took a third cup, which started the third course, and after giving thanks, because that's what they did at the end of the meal, he gave it to them and he said, drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. Those two verses have a lot of detail. So we're just going to put them on the shelf, and we're going to wait 3 to 5 minutes, and then we're going to take a closer look at those verses and figure out what all those statements, those phrases are talking about and how that fits in. Because the covenant is like a whole different image that we're drawn into to learn other things about Jesus' death for us and the significance of that. But during the third course, he shares the cup with all the disciples. He invites them all into this covenant, whatever that is. And he calls it the blood of the covenant. And that's going to be significant, and we'll unpack that in just a couple minutes. Then it says, after singing a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. And so we think of it as like, I wonder what hymn they pulled out. Like, was it Nothing But the Blood of Jesus? Like, what hymn did they sing? Because that's how we see hymns in our culture. This, type of Christian music from the past couple centuries that was popular, But really we should understand it in light of the Passover. And so they read the last several Psalms. They recited Psalm 115 to 118. And these Psalms, each one of them, bless God for becoming our salvation. That phrase is in there twice. God becoming our rescue or becoming our salvation. And it compares God to a rejected rock who becomes the cornerstone of a building. So again, if you're a stonemason, this might be relevant. If you're not, this is again first century building type talk. And so you're going to build a building, and you're going to base both of the sides of the building on a stone that you're going to set at the corner so you can build off of it. So you need a stone that's straight, the corners are sharp so that your building isn't, doesn't head out this way and, slanted at a weird angle in this direction and then this side of the building straight. You want something that's kind of like a 90-degree angle cornerstone that's going to set and determine both sides of the building so you have a building that's sturdy. And it says, God in this passage, in Psalm 115 to 118, specifically Psalm 118, God is like that rock that the builders picked up and they thought, nah, this is a trashy rock. I'm not going to base a building off this, and they just throw it in the scrap heap or in the dumpster today. But the psalm concludes that, the one that the builders rejected, they thought wasn't worth anything, this stone that God is, it's become the cornerstone, the one that the whole building is based off of. And so again, we look at that, we think of it in light of some maybe current Christian songs like Cornerstone. We apply that to Jesus, and that might have some significance for us as well. So that's how they conclude the Passover meal. But I want to just step back to verses 27 and 28 because it's going to give us some crucial information about covenants. How many of you have gotten into any covenants lately? Anybody out there? Anybody in a covenant right now? Not a convent, but a covenant? Yes? Oh, hey! So Dave says he's in a covenant. It's a covenant called marriage. And marriage actually is probably one of the few things in our culture that we could actually call a covenant. It's very, very similar to this type of relationship that we'll talk about. Yeah, but it's not a contract. Some people are like, I entered into a covenant, like I signed the dotted line. It's more than that. Because when we talk about covenants, at their core, they're not contracts, they're working relationships. And if you happen to be in a working relationship called a marriage or another type of relationship, you understand, it takes work. And there's some common goals that you're all working toward. And there's some love that needs to be the foundation of that relationship in the first place. And so a covenant, it's a partnership that's entered into by two people or maybe two groups of people who want to love each other well and work together to accomplish the same goals. And when you enter into a covenant, usually there's a promise involved. Think about a wedding. Do you make any vows? Do you make any promises to Sue? Couple, probably. Every day. And there's more beyond that initial vow. But it usually involves a promise, and it usually involves a present. Did you give her any gifts at your wedding? Put anything on her finger? Maybe? Yeah. A lot of times in our culture, we give and receive rings, right? And so that would be a gift that would kind of seal the covenant or symbolize, remind us of the partnership that we've entered into. And then also, unlike maybe a marriage, in the ancient Near East, covenants also agreed to a severe penalty if you ever parted ways. And we'll talk about that in a second. So if you decide that you want to abandon the covenant that you make, there's some pretty harsh penalties attached to that in the ancient Near Eastern world, in the times we could think of as like the Old Testament of the Bible. And in the Bible, God invites people into covenants with himself, partnerships with himself, because he wants them to be able to give love and receive his love, and he really wants them to join him in his work in the world. That's how things started off with Adam and Eve. We see that from the first page of the Bible. God has always desired to have a partnership with humans. You could even say that that's what you're made for. That's what humans were made for, was to be in a covenant, in a partnership with God, working toward the same goals. And this is really cool when we look at some of the key covenants that God makes with people throughout the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament of the Bible. Think about Adam and Eve. God invites them into this partnership of being his images and of ruling the world, its creatures, the land, of bringing out and cultivating potential throughout the earth with him. He invites them to transform the entire earth into a beautiful garden like the one that he placed them in, filled with people who walk and talk with God every day. Isn't that a beautiful invitation, a beautiful partnership? He invites them into that. God invites Noah to heal a world that has been completely destroyed by selfishness, by violence, by natural disaster. He says, why don't you walk with me? Why don't you partner with me and we'll rebuild this place? We'll make it something beautiful. And we won't have the violence and the selfishness that drove things before this. God calls Abraham aside and he says, I want to make your family a blessing to every other country in the entire world. So will you partner with me? And let's do that together. He invites the nation of Israel to model the good life. He says, I'll tell you what life is about. I'll tell you how to know the difference between good and evil. It's by doing justice. It's by loving me well. It's by loving other people well. And he has all these instructions that he gives them to kind of point them in the right direction. That's what God invites Israel into. God pulls aside David and he says, I want to invite you and all your descendants to be humble rulers, kings, rulers, who will follow my heart and who will care for people like shepherds, shepherd people. And I want you to do it forever. He invites all these people into these different partnerships. And sadly, all of these partnerships, they fall apart. And it falls apart before God's dreams for this world are ever realized. And it doesn't fall apart because of God. It falls apart because of humans. Because they decide, I'm going to part ways. I want out of this partnership. Because I'd rather follow my own definition of what good and bad is. I'd rather follow my own selfishness. I don't really care about God's ambitions in the world and what he's invited me into. I want to follow my ambitions. I want to accomplish what I want to accomplish in this world. And I want to live my life for myself. So things completely fall apart. So just again to recap that, covenants are working relationships entered into by people or groups, sometimes with God, who want to love each other well and form a partnership to accomplish the same goals. And again, in the ancient Near East, they involve a promise, a present, and some kind of penalty, which we'll talk about. I want to reread those verses 27 and 28 again from Matthew 26. Jesus took a third cup, and after giving thanks, he gave it to them and said, drink from it, all of you. For this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. This is my blood of the covenant. If you look at Luke, when Luke records these events, he puts in one word, an adjective, in front of covenant. And that adjective is new. Because there have been a lot of former covenants that God made with people, and quite honestly, they didn't work out so well. And so what Jesus, especially in Luke's account, is inviting his followers into is a new sort of covenant. And this is one that's going to remedy the problems of, and also address the penalty for the failed partnerships that people got out of in the past. This is going to be something that's a little bit different than the way things have happened in the past. And it needs to be, because what's happened in the past is clearly not working. Back in the days of the prophet Jeremiah in the Old Testament, God spoke about this time when he would introduce a new covenant, because God knew as well that those old partnerships were just not working. And looking ahead toward that, he said, look, the days are coming when I'll make a new covenant with Israel and with Judah. This one will not be like the covenant, the partnership I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt. My covenant that they broke, even though I'm their master. Instead, this is the covenant that I'm going to make in those days. I will put my teaching within them and write it on their hearts. I will be their God and they will be my people. No longer will one say, know the Lord, for they will all know me. I will forgive their sins and I will never again remember their sins. So there's two very strikingly different things about this. One is it involves a change of heart. And then the second thing is it involves forgiveness of some penalty. Because, again, in the ancient Near Eastern world, every time you agree to a covenant, you also agree to a penalty if you back out of that. So the question is, what was that penalty for backing out of a partnership with another human or with God? And to understand that, you've got to understand how covenants worked. When the Bible describes making a covenant, the word that you read in your English Bible is make, is not the word make. It's the word cut, like scissors cut or knife cut. And they had this practice of cutting a covenant. So whenever you wanted to enter into a partnership with any person or with God, there'd be a little ceremony, and you do a little cutting. And this is how you do it. You can see this in a few places in the Old Testament where people cut covenants, like Genesis 15 and Jeremiah 34. But what they would do is when they agreed to enter into a partnership, and I guarantee you this didn't happen at your wedding ceremony, they would take a goat or a cow and they would cut the animal up into pieces. They kill it, cut it up. And then they would lay the pieces opposite each other and leave an aisle down the middle. And I guarantee you as well, when you walk down your wedding aisle, it wasn't flanked by steak on both sides, right? It wasn't, there was no meat on both sides. But in the ancient Near East, there was meat. They did this. They cut a covenant. And the reason why they would do that is they would make the promises and the stipulations of the covenant, and then typically at least the weaker party, like the one who had the greatest chance of trying to get out of this promise, this covenant, this partnership, sometimes both parties, they would walk down the aisle between the pieces of slaughtered meat or animals, and they would say something like, "May it be unto me, just like these slaughtered animals, if I don't maintain the stipulation of our agreement." That's pretty harsh, isn't it? If I back out of this partnership, may I be chopped up into pieces like these animals and scattered on the ground. That's what they were saying. That's what they were agreeing to. So the penalty for breaking a covenant, it was receiving the same fate of the animal who was cut to make it official. So again, not typically part of our standard marriage ceremonies these days. But they took it, or were supposed to take it, very seriously. But as we see, that's not how human nature actually plays out. So the phrase blood of the covenant that Jesus refers to, it is taking us back to this practice because there is blood that's involved when a covenant is sealed. And in Exodus 23, it's talking about Israel entering into a covenant with God to follow his instructions. You think of the giving of the law on Mount Sinai to Moses, to live God's way, to live out God's justice, to love God and to love people in the ways that God had outlined. And they're entering into this, and this is the whole process describing this covenant. It says in Exodus 23:3, Moses came and he told the people all the commands of the Lord and all the ordinances. So here's the promises, here's the stipulation for our agreement with God. And here's what the people say. It says in a single voice, so they're all in agreement. We will do everything God has instructed us. We got this. We'll do everything. And so Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. It says next morning he got up early. He set up an altar on one side, which represents God. And he set up 12 pillars on the other side of the aisle, think of it that way, that represent the 12 tribes of Israel. So he's going to do this little ceremony. Too many people to get them all out there, but we're going to represent them with some stuff. And it says, then he sent out young Israelite men, and they offered burnt offerings and sacrificed bulls as fellowship offerings to the Lord. Moses took half the blood from those sacrifices, and he put it in basins, bowls. The other half he threw onto the altar. He splattered onto the altar. And that was God's agreement saying, I agree to enter into a covenant in a partnership with these people. May this be on me. May this blood be on me if I back out of this. And then it says he took the covenant scroll and he read it aloud to the people. Like, are you sure you want to get into this? Are you sure you want this partnership? And again they say, we will do and obey all that the Lord has commanded. We're in agreement. So Moses says, all right, I'm going to take the rest of this blood, and he actually splatters it on the people this time. But it's the same effect as them walking through the pieces of meat on both sides of the aisle. And he says, this is the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made or cut with you concerning all these words. So you agreed, this is the blood, you're receiving it, you're locked in. And so if you back out of it, you're also responsible for the penalty. And so when Jesus said, "This is my blood of the covenant, this cup, drink from it, all of you," he was saying, I want to enter into partnership with you. Here's this cup. And if you drink of it, guess what you're doing? You're agreeing. You're saying, I'm in. I'm in with you, Jesus. I want to partner with you in this world to accomplish the things that you want to accomplish. What are those things? The same things we talked about a few minutes ago that God wanted to partner with Adam and Eve to accomplish, and with Noah to accomplish, and with Moses to accomplish, and with Israel to accomplish. Those kinds of things to transform this world into the place that he wanted it to be and the way that he wanted it to be when he started this whole creation thing out in the first place. We're entering into that. That's what his followers were entering into. Those same goals that were never realized. And when we take communion, that's what we're saying as well. I'm in it, Jesus. I want to join you in partnership and represent you in this world. We're partners together, and we're going toward the same goals. And love is driving this and motivating it. Your love for us and our love for you, and your love for other people and our love for other people, that's what's driving this. We receive it, we're locked in, we're committed to this covenant. But he also ends it this way in verse 28. He says, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. And so, again, this is a new sort of covenant. And it's got to deal with all the problems from the former covenants. And one of those problems was our heart desires and our goals. And so somehow through entering into this partnership with Jesus, his death for us, one thing it makes possible is that there's a change of heart that happens. And we know as we read on in the New Testament, it talks about followers of Jesus being filled and dwelled with God's Holy Spirit. And God's Spirit starts to transform people and their hearts and their desires from the inside out so that we want what God wants. And our passions and goals become God's passions and goals in this world. And our selfishness starts to take a back seat to God's plans. And so that was part of the remedy. And Jesus' death, again, makes that possible. And then there's the other aspect. There's the penalty, right? Because there's a steep price in Bible covenants for breaking your covenant, right? And that is, may I be like this animal whose blood was shed. May my blood be shed as well. And that's, again, where the sacrifice of Jesus comes in another way. He says, for the forgiveness of sins. And so essentially, what he's doing is he is saying, I know you. And even though I transform your hearts, you're probably not going to stick this partnership out, at least all the time. And the people in the past certainly didn't stick it out. I know you're going to fail. And when you fail, I know what you've agreed to. You've agreed to you being like that animal. You've agreed to this the price being your blood. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pour out my blood, he's speaking of his death on the cross, for the forgiveness of sins. To release, that's what the word forgiveness means. To release you from the consequences of your failure to live up to this partnership. Because I know you're all going to fail in some ways, and you already have. And so I'm going to pay this penalty that you deserve for you. Because I know you're going to get out of this partnership at one time or another. You're going to forsake it. And so that's a beautiful picture. And we think, well, why did Jesus have to die? Well, we agreed to some stuff. Maybe you didn't even know that you agreed to some things. But when we join in partnership with God, if we back out, we've agreed to some penalties. So Jesus took that on himself. And the whole heart of that, the whole heart of a covenant is a relationship. Because Jesus desperately wants you, and he wants me, and he wants all of humanity back into a partnership with God. He wants to restore it. He wants to change people's hearts. And he wants to eliminate any type of penalty that would maybe make you fearful of entering into that covenant, that partnership in the first place. And he's done all that and paved a way for this eternal relationship with God and partnership with God through his death on the cross. But there wasn't any other way, because that's how covenants work. So I want to conclude our time this morning with, I think it's very fitting, with communion or Eucharist or the Lord's table or the Lord's Supper, however you define it. And I need a few people to come up and help me pass these out. Just 4 volunteers. Doesn't have to be specific people. Slipped out there. And as we partake of this morning, I'd guess there might be a few more aspects of this symbol that are going to be meaningful to you. Thank you. Thanks. So as they're passing these out, again, just a short view. In a moment, we'll take the bread and we'll break it. And what is that broken bread? What did it symbolize to the Jewish people at the Passover? Bread of what? Affliction. Yeah, suffering, slavery, all that. So when they broke it and they passed it around the table, that was the bread of affliction. What does it symbolize to Jesus? His body. His body was broken through affliction on the cross, but it was also broken like that animal to inaugurate a covenant. And that animal was broken into pieces to officially begin the covenant. And Jesus' body was broken to bring us into a restored partnership or covenant relationship with God. That's what this broken body, this broken bread symbolizes. And what does the cup symbolize? Jesus' blood. What did it symbolize in the Passover meal? Do you remember? It accompanied something that we normally do at the beginning of a meal. Yeah, the blessing, right? The thanksgiving is the actual word that Matthew uses. The thankfulness. So it's a cup of thankfulness, and that's fitting for us, right? But for Jesus, it's his blood of the covenant. And that's indicative of 2 things. When you drink it and when I drink it, we may not have realized this, but when we do, we're saying, I'm in, Jesus. I'm in. I want to be in partnership with you. I want to be in partnership with God. I want to accomplish your purposes in the world. I want to live out your kingdom. I'm in. That's part of what you're doing. And the other part of it is Jesus is saying, but when you do this, you're agreeing to a penalty. But I know you'll fail at times. And so what I'm doing is I'm preempting this. I'm providing a way for you to be completely, eternally forgiven so that this penalty never falls on you for backing out of the partnership at times. I'm going to take it upon me. So there's no fear in that. I think we heard about casting out fear during the prayer time today. It's kind of fitting, right? And so as we drink this, it's also a reminder, not just that we're accepting this covenant, but that we don't have to live in fear. And so let's partake of these symbols today, of the bread that represents Christ's affliction and his brokenness to bring us into a covenant with God, a partnership with him, and also the cup that represents our acceptance of this. We're in Jesus, but also the fact that we don't have to fear. Thank you, Jesus.